And thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here, live Monday through Friday, 12 noon Eastern Standard Time on YouTube and its subscribing platforms. My guest is Jack Gist. He's a columnist. He's an author. He has a column that caught my attention up at the Catholic World Report, dealing with, I just clicked it off. Hubris or Bust, the blind march of racial re-education. Jack, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, and Happy New Year.
As to you and yours. So Jack, this is an agenda that I think it was a month or so ago, President Trump issued an executive order basically banning this type of education from federal programs, which of course is within his constitutional purview as president. But the program itself is still on the march. It's making its way into private schools. It's making its way into states. It's even making its way into corporations. Talk about exactly what this is, this racial re-education.
Well, it's sort of an insidious effort, I think, from my perspective anyway, on it's based basically on, some of the listeners will have heard of White Fragility and How to Be an Anti-Racist, those books that are New York Times best-selling authors. They've marketed this in such a way that they can take it into the marketplace and have little training things for, supposedly, they're for professional development. Or I call it just social programming, though, because basically you get separated out. I was talking to my brother-in-law, and he actually had to go to one of these things. He works for a corporation. You actually get separated out by race, basically, and you have to go. He did it, his anyway. And you go and you're told, if you're white, that you're sort of you're on stolen land from natives. You're going to feel uncomfortable here. You're a racist, whether you care to admit it or not. If you deny this fact, then you're a racist. If you admit it, then you have to go through this program to sort of overcome this racism, which you can never really overcome because it's institutionalized. It's from the get-go. It's from the 1619 Project forward. All of this ties into the bigger narrative, the larger narrative of the social reprogramming. And I think that at the bottom, it's an epistemological problem that these two sides are never they can't coexist almost. It's the old school classical liberalism of correspondence theory of knowledge, where we can actually learn something about the world from the world. We don't just make it up. The critical theory people and all the different offshoots, whether it be critical race theory, whether it be LGBTQ theory, whatever, all these queer theory, all these different theories, they truly believe at the bottom that we create reality through language. We don't, it doesn't necessarily correspond with reality. That goes all the way back sort of to Achman, though, and his nominalism, where we're just making up words and place them on reality. They don't necessarily correspond to anything. Therefore, there is no human nature. It's malleable. We get to create it the way we want to create it. And this boils down even further to a Nietzschean will to power. Whoever makes the best story and people buy it, they get to run the show.
So we're getting into some great philosophical questions here. You trace it back to Occam, who was a very influential figure on the 18th century Enlightenment in Europe. He was seen as sort of one of the fathers of modern science, if you will. I would more accurately describe it as scientism, which is kind of a worship of what is purported to be existence and reality. But yet, at the core of that philosophy is the idea that you create realities, you create existence. This is what Marxism is all about, too, that there is no objective truth. There is no discernible order to the universe. Everything is whatever you say it is. It all comes out of your mind. And, it kind of reflects the darker side of the Enlightenment. And this is sort of the underlying theory of these groups. I mean, that they believe that, they can define what you are based upon their opinions rather than on fact. And I think once one accepts that thesis, then they're vulnerable to listening to so-called experts people who hold themselves up as enlightened, to help them define what is true, because nobody can do that alone. There is, it tends to open the door to great leaders like Adolf Hitler, for example, and other movement leaders who are the head of these movements. And this whole kind of race theory thing reminds me of Nazism. I mean, isn't this what the Nazis said about Jews? That they kind of conspire to and are secretly running the world and oppressing you, and thus you have to, get your power back by opposing them. It creates this kind of paradigm. I mean, except instead they replace that with white people, allegedly, whatever that means. And who gets to decide who's white? But that somehow the white man is oppressing you, and that you're being oppressive because of the history of wars between American settlers and Native Americans, and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, it's it's very, very negative, and it's based upon a real false premise, as we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that we have to admit to some facts, and I'm willing to admit to the facts here. America does have some racism in its past. It's just everybody knows that. It's out there for everybody to see. But these people tend to think that they can stop something on a dime like that and go, okay, for example, the 1619 Project, I go, okay, here's where you first brought African slaves to the American continent, which wasn't true anyway. They were here with the Spanish beforehand, but nevertheless, so that is the defining moment of America, and America is stripped of world history. The rest of the history of the world has no bearing on the fact that you brought slaves here, and your entire institution is based upon it. All your institutions, your Constitution, and everything else, when really the American Constitution, although we have not lived up to it, I think people have said America is always in search of its soul. That's what we do.
Right, part of the human experience.
Yeah, the human experience. We're trying to, but it's also based on a very prominent factor that we are individuals with inalienable rights. America didn't really invent this; they put it into practice as a democracy, as a way of government, a way of life. Did they live up to it right away? No, they knew they couldn't live up to it right away.
We still don't live up to it. I mean, that's just, we're imperfect human beings. We're always exploring ways to enhance sovereignty, individual sovereignty under God, and kind of I hate to use the word, but collective understanding of wisdom, over time. You talk about the 1619 Project. I mean, it's, that we are all to essentially be crucified on this original sin of our forefathers, some of them allowing slavery, when in fact slavery, unfortunately, was an institution that was practiced all over the world at the time, that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, while not abolishing slavery, and yes, Jefferson was a slave owner, no question about that, it was the beginning steps toward the abolition of slavery, which would have been a significant pivot in history. And also some of the people that embrace this idea now that somehow we're all guilty collectively because our ancestors had slaves, some of them, they are advocates of a philosophy that is involved with slavery today, that is communism. I mean, and Nazism. You cannot have a revival of slavery where you have millions of people losing their freedom and effectively becoming slaves of the state because they have no property, they've got no rights, everything has been collectivized, and tell me about slavery. I mean, if you're opposed to slavery, then you want to see progress in terms of recognizing what we do know collectively at this point, which is the dignity of the individual, and that one individual has no right to own another, and the state has no right to own people. I mean, slavery or not, I mean, that really is what it comes down to. If they want to rail against slavery, then let's have a look at what slavery is.
Absolutely. And, the dignity of the human person is follows Western civilization. It's an idea, of course, and we're always striving for it, and we're not anywhere near it, but we have come closer. Progress is a slow movement. It's
Yeah.
not this rapid thing. What we're seeing now is, and I spent a lot of time, I think I told you before, reading Nietzsche when I was young, unsupervised, and it's
Yeah.
sort of, so I'm a Nietzsche influenced person. And really, for all that he got wrong, which he got a lot wrong, he got a lot right too. And this boils down to a basic will to power, slave morality versus master morality. There's either masters and there's slaves, and that's all there is. So where Marx boils down things to economics, you have all these reductionists pop up in the 20th century. Everybody's trying to reduce the human experience to this or that or the other thing. Nietzsche's is they reduce to the will to power, and they've bought into this whole narrative. Either you're an oppressor or you're oppressed. That's all there is. There's no other way out of it. There's no individual. There's no individual to even weigh these questions in their minds. You're either an oppressor or you're oppressed. And if you're the oppressor, you want to keep oppressing. And if you're the oppressed, you want to take over the oppressor and play their role. So it's just this kind of hellish dystopia that they seem to be striving for, some sort of hellish dystopia, which is sort of beyond, why would you do that?
No, I hear you. So no, let's talk a little bit about that, because we're talking philosophy here, really. And it seems to me that these ideas contradict the basic understanding that emerged both out of the Greek philosophers, but also out of the Torah and out of Christianity. And that is that the individual is limited sovereignty under the great sovereign, which is God. And that we're created in the image of God. That's what the Torah says, both men and women. Thus, we're equal, although different, but we are images of God. We're not God. And as such, we cannot know all the mysteries of the universe. Only God knows that. But yet we can know a lot, and that history does progress in the sense that we're learning with every generation various modalities that improve life on Earth. I mean, that make us more conscious of our potential and of who we are. And there are certain things that we acquire as individuals and as societies. And you talk about how Nietzsche began separating these things. I think that it starts in the modern times with Descartes, even though he was a great man and he was a devout Catholic. I think that some of his ideas might have been misinterpreted. I don't know if he meant them to be what they were, but he began this process of bifurcation of ideas, that basically when he said, I think, therefore I am, I forget the Latin term for it, ergo sum, cogito
Ergo sum.
ergo sum. That basically what he was saying was both good and bad, in that he said that by my ability to identify the nature of a thing, I exist. It proves that I exist. And that's true. But at the same time, he kind of boiled down existence to simply what a mental thing. I mean, what the senses and the mind are able to produce, rather than looking at the human being in the context of order, of logos, as they say in Christianity, or as the Greeks said. This idea that there is a divine, and that we all are part of that creation, and we all have consciousness and a role to play within it, and that while there are particulars and differences, and those need to be identified, basically they're not all separate. Everything is kind of interdependent. Everything is part of an order. And I think that Nietzsche and Marx took that to separate out economy. And in that, he was also inspired by Adam Smith, who did the same thing, I think, inadvertently. Somehow economy became separated. It was like outside of who we are. The word economy comes from the Greek term ekonoma, which means household. And the economy is part of how you function as a household. And that not only includes like material wealth, but it also includes spiritual matters, and it includes experience. It includes a whole picture. But what Adam Smith and then Marx did was they separated all of that away. They removed the spiritual and the moral content of economy, and they made it into this separate, sterile entity by which you would just simply add up become a bean counter. I mean, you'd add up numbers. And I think that Nietzsche took that even a step further by saying that everything is based on the will to power, that it's all a matter of people harnessing this energy, this will to make something happen. And if they're able to do that, then they can make it happen just based upon their will, not based upon any kind of integrated understanding of existence.
Yeah, I think so. The image of God can be distorted because it's an image, and leave it to us humans to distort that image. When you're talking about logos in the ancient Greeks, they sort of saw logos as the inherent in the universe. And if you tuned into it, you could learn things from it. So it was a participatory, it's not a control situation, it's you participate in existence. And I think that that goes all the way up through the Greeks run into the Jewish tradition, and that's a good thing. That's why we're a Western tradition. Is those two come in and they meet together, and Christianity comes in, and you have this whole thing. But in Christianity and in ancient Greece and everything else, to a lesser extent, participation is you participate in being. You're not out to control being. I think with Descartes comes in. And I think it's probably inadvertently on his part, but as many things get twisted up and sort of distorted as things go on. When he says, "I think, therefore I am," the I gets separated out from that which it's participating in. It's taken out of the I guess you could call it reality. You remove the I from the reality. So certainly, for an economy to work, it has to be more for me to use my computer program and add up the numbers. I have to participate. I have to work. I have to figure out what I need, what I don't need, what's good for my family, what I need to give to charity. All these are considerations that I'm participating with the economy, not controlling the economy. So that sort of seems like a minor distinction, but I think it's a big distinction, actually.
Oh, it's huge. And so we have the emergence in our own time, as you said, Occam, and the emergence of scientism, in this idea that if we have the will to make something happen, if we can separate things out, then we can create realities, that there is no objective reality. Everything is what you say it is. Moral standards, ethical standards, these things are invented. And once you come to that insane conclusion, then you can march in like Marx and say, well, reality is created. And I think he got this from a misinterpretation of Hegel, who I also understand was a devout Christian. But you can say that reality is created by people in power, and that they then exploit everyone else. This is the central conspiracy theory of Marxism, the idea of exploitation. Somehow that these people in power, whether they know it or not, have created reality to benefit them and to screw everyone else. And that therefore you have this perpetual dualism, this constant revolution that has turned into a real revolution with hundreds of millions of people killed in the 20th century, where you have to fight against this power. And the irony of the whole thing, when you get down to it, is that let's say, for the sake of argument, that there's some truth to this. The people in power, the elites, the top 1%, as the Occupy Wall Street movement used to say, those people support this theory. They are leftists. They actually view this at some level as something that can increase their own power. So it's kind of like a strange contradiction that we get stuck in. And the result is that on all sides, we lose the sense of our own individual identity and our own power, which is that we are all images of God. We're all sovereign in a limited way under God. Everything becomes collectivized.
Yes, the individual is wiped out of this equation. And here's where Kierkegaard comes, the great critic of Hegel. I mean, his whole philosophy is fueled on it against Hegel, as he says, well, you've built this grand house of history and the spirit of the world spirit and everything else, but you didn't build a room for yourself. The individual is subsumed by this great world spirit, where you have Napoleon's, and Kierkegaard, of course, was radically individualized. What we have to do somehow, now I don't understand really why the elites, the 1%ers, are proponents of this Marxist sort of leanings at this point, because it spells their own doom eventually. If you just look at history, I mean, one thing that I think that people are really, I think we're teetering on an abyss here, is people don't know history very well at all. They think that that's something you create as you go along too, as you can see by, let's get rid of all the statues of this, that person. Let's revise the history books so they read 1619 rather than 1776. This is it's not a covert, it's an attempt, it's an in-your-face attempt to rewrite history, because we can do that too, because we create reality, right? And so, but I don't understand why the elites are playing along with it, because these inevitably, you eat your own. You're already seeing it started to happen, because they don't understand human nature. Human nature is a fallen thing. We're not perfect, and we're not going to be perfect, and we have to keep a check on some of our desires. But when you just boil everything down to power, and all of a sudden the enemy's gone, say the old school, they win and they wipe us out, who are they going to fight? They have to have an enemy. If they don't have an enemy, they're not going to exist. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature, because it's a denial of human nature.
Right. And it's also has to create this duality, this Manichean approach, where you have absolute good and absolute evil, and they define what that means. There's no in between, and that they can then justify doing incredibly atrocious things in the name of fighting this evil, however they define it. And that the reason they're attracted to it is because it's power, because it asks the individual to give up their freedom. It sells the individual. It's a marketing campaign.
Mm-hmm.
If you give up your freedom, you give up your property, you give up your identity, you give up your, you make yourself absolutely equal. And if you feel bad about not being absolutely equal, then we're going to reward you with some kind of weird utopian fuzzy peace in the world. You're going to have, it's the lie of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. You can know all good and evil. You can become like God. You can become God, basically. They want to overthrow God with their own reality. God is the author of all that's real. They want to overthrow that, and they want to decide what is real and what isn't, and they're willing to redefine it any way they see it. I mean, this, not to get political here, but this election is an example of that. I mean, it's one of the biggest lies that we've ever seen in our lifetime. It's a complete fraud, but they're going to define it as otherwise. And if you disagree, then you're going to be, thrown out, on the street. But getting back to the subject at hand, this movement that we're talking about, which involves an organized group that goes into schools, it goes into businesses, and it teaches everyone that they're racist against Black people and that they're nativist against Native Americans. It's a very negative and malevolent view of humanity and of this country, which they target. I mean, they wouldn't say this in Cuba. This is, and it's untrue. I mean, first of all, racism in this country, while it's there because it's a bad side of human nature, it has been greatly reduced, especially since World War II, and it's accelerated in the 1960s with the civil rights movement, which was largely a Christian movement. And today, you can get ahead if you're Black. It's not like Jim Crow is over. I'm not saying there's never racism, but for the most part, I think this is a pretty good time in America to be Black. And I would probably say likewise for Native Americans. I mean, this is no longer the time. So Wounded Knee happened 100 years ago. Now you've got Foxwoods Casino. I mean, you have opportunity to create these vibrant societies, in these Indian reservations, if they choose to. I'm not
And,
saying it's easy, but there are plenty of people of goodwill who want to help, and you have to clean house in terms of your own tribal governments if you want to have improvement, and not be focused on this kind of idea that in the past there was injustice. There were wars, and you lost the wars, but that's the history of human nature. I mean, we can't undo that history. I'm not saying that every nation has that history. Indian tribes were at war with each other before the settlers, and they were apparently, if you take a look at the history of the Sioux, they were, Indians were welcoming in settlers because the Sioux were very oppressive to smaller tribes and very brutal. So this is human nature. We can't undo that. And if they want to advocate ending racism, or at least reducing racism, because you're never going to end it. It's like what Eisenhower said, you cannot regulate a man's heart. But to reduce it and make it less relevant, like, for example, the way anti-Semitism is less relevant because the Jews continue to ignore it and achieve. And, I give you a personal example. I mean, my late father wanted to have a boat at a yacht club in Boston, and he couldn't because because he was Jewish, and there was an they were anti-Semitic. So he got together with some other like-minded Jewish boat owners and non-Jewish, and they opened their own yacht club.
Yeah, see.
and it eventually it became the best yacht club in Greater Boston, to the point where the anti-Semitic yacht clubs decided to let them in and welcome them to come in, because they wanted to have social events, and yacht clubs like to, boats like to go visit. So that's how you overcome it, rather than be there and kind of sitting in ashes and being forlorn about the past. You build your own life, you develop your own situation as best you can, and you recognize that nothing is going to be perfect. I don't think anti-Semitism has disappeared. It hasn't, but it's not going to hold me back from achieving whatever I want to achieve in life for myself and my family. I mean, and when I see it, I call it out, but it's not like, it's not a systemic problem. And I think the same thing could be said for racism.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And so when we go back to these programs, they're making good money too. These little programs, these social programming, they're making a lot of dough on the side here.
Probably getting a lot of grants from the government too. I wouldn't be surprised if they
taxpayer money.
Yeah, this new stimulus package probably slipped in a few dollars, I'm sure.
Yeah, and the whole thing is just ludicrous. It's obvious to anybody that can even think a little bit. If you set people in a room and you pit them against each other, you hate you and you hate you and you hate each other, and you'll always hate each other. There's not much you can do about it except admit it. That's just going to cause more hatred, people. It's not going to. But that must be that's an old Marxist tactic: divide and conquer. Keep them at each other's throats so you can do what you want, basically. And I think that's why the 1%ers do it. Frankly, they like foment. They can do what they want, like with this COVID thing. And I happen to agree with you on the election was, to me, and I followed it pretty closely. I worry about these screens, all these information we get off these screens. You don't know what to believe anymore and what not to believe.
Right.
But if you just look at it from a sort of a common sense, I'm from Wyoming, common sense perspective, Biden just he didn't campaign. For one thing, he's not popular for his age. It just doesn't add up. Okay, the whole thing doesn't add up. And
I mean, just now that you're on the topic, since this is happening as we speak, we have to cover current events. If anybody gets to see the testimony yesterday in Georgia for the special Senate committee, I hope it's still available online. I know that Bill Still over at YouTube carries it. He's an excellent YouTube host. It is so gripping in terms of the witnesses to the kind of fraud that took place there. And Georgia's only one of the 7 states that were targeted for this, that Giuliani brought up the point. He made an excellent opening statement where he pointed out that in every single precinct, Republicans did very well, and they totally beat their Democratic opponents in general, and in some cases in pretty large margins, except for the president, where Trump didn't do well by the same exact percentage across the board. Like, I think it was 7%. And that there were two counties where Biden got 95% of the vote. And one of those counties was the one where they had that video of the woman with the blonde braids stuffing the ballot box. I mean, it's so obviously a fraud that, I mean, if we don't stand up to this now, we're never going to have another free election. I mean, this is the last sort of frontier of freedom, is the fact that we have one man, one vote and an election. And I think that the Dominion software, they actually acknowledge in their manual that they don't tabulate the votes. They estimate the votes. In other words, they weigh them. It's not like one man, one vote. And the way they weighed them, according to evidence that's brought forth by Sidney Powell, who's this brilliant lawyer, is that they gave, Trump, 1.7, and they gave Biden 2.2. So whenever Trump reached a threshold of 1.7, it would stop. Whereas Biden, they basically, made up the difference. I don't understand how that works technically, but there are a lot of people who do understand it, and who are data experts who are talking about this. It's fraud. I shouldn't use that word because I'll get knocked off YouTube. I take that back. It's improprietous.
Well, to draw it back into our larger discussion, one man, one vote. I don't know if you're familiar. Are you familiar with Orestes Brownson at all? The 19th century Catholic thinker. He was sort of he knew Emerson, and he was, for a while he was this, for a while he was that,
Mhm.
but he was really a pretty good political thinker. And he thought that America was good in the sense that one man, one vote also goes religiously. God gave us free choice, and that's the ultimate thing that we have. And that's why basically we're here on the planet, is to exercise that free choice. And that's whether to choose God or choose whatever you're going to choose. You have to be allowed to choose. You can't be forced to choose this way or that way or any way. It's in your own heart. You have to do it. The consequences will come later. But that sort of translates into one man, one vote. And when that becomes suspect, and I don't care what anybody tells me, when you have a large percentage of this country that think that vote was a fraud. There's half of the country, I'd say, that's just being throwing a number out
At
there,
least.
that truly believes that was a fraudulent vote. They don't buy it. And if half the population doesn't buy the vote, we're in trouble, man. We're in trouble.
Right. And I think that it's very telling that all we're saying is, let's have an honest accounting of the vote. Let's have audits. Let's really, do this. And you have people resisting that in these states, the governors, the secretaries of state, both Democrat and Republican too, I point out. And, they're doing whatever they can to block that from happening. So why? I mean, it's obviously, a problem. But to get back to your report on this insidious program, where we're taught that we have something against Black people and something against Native Americans. This is serious. They actually have instructors who are going in and conducting these kind of like sensitivity training, I guess that the Soviets would have called it, re-education camp. Talk a little bit more about what they're doing. I mean, what is this? How does this thing translate?
Well, if you look at the book, White Fragility, it's a circular argument that you can't get out of. The whole thing is based on bad logic. And so is which is an equal part in this, how to be an anti-racist. It's based on a false dichotomy. Either you're a racist or you're not a racist, and there's nothing in between. You can't be a Martin Luther King guy who say, well, I just want to judge people on the content of their character. That's not allowed. You have to judge them on their skin color, their group. Again, it strips away individuality. And I haven't had to do this. I work at a university, and they haven't come knocking on our door yet. But when they do, I'm going to refuse. If they do, I would refuse to take it, because it really is. And I'm not a lawyer, nor do I pretend to be one. but I have read the Civil Rights Act, and it seems like this is a blatant, flagrant foul against the Civil Rights Act when you're because of their race, you're targeting people and telling them that they're wicked people and they need to do something to make amends. And again, it's because they're trying to, I think, I don't know what to think about a lot of these people sometimes. Do they really believe this stuff? Some of them, I guess, probably do. Or or is it just a game? Is it just a political power game to them to get more clout and power? Because I can't believe that anybody, like I grew up in the West, I live in the Southwest now. It's kind of a crucible. There's a lot of diversity, ethnic diversity here. And frankly, I don't feel any tension. I lived in the deep South for a while when I was a teenager and in my early 20s. I did feel a little bit of it there. But in the Southwest here, and I think Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian, that said the frontier was sort of the crucible that created the American character and made it not British anymore. It is what it is because of that coming together, and it was violent and everything else. But out of that crucible, we get an American character. I truly believe that, and I worked on the Navajo reservation at Dene College for about a year, and I had a Navajo friend who was pretty politically sensitive to a lot of things, but I just told him he went to school back east on a Ivy League scholarship and things, and he had been trained basically, if you say that I don't see color, then that means you're a racist. But he said, well, if anybody, and I took this as a great compliment of my life, he said, if anybody says that they actually don't see color, I believe you when you say it, because I really don't. And I think most people, in my experience, I am from the West, so maybe it's different, although I've spent time on other places as well. But I think most people judge each other on the content of their character. I truly, firmly believe that in my heart. I think if you just let them do that, they'll do that.
I agree. That's the normal condition. We all are self-interested, and we surround ourselves with like-minded people who are going to help us. And it doesn't matter what their color is. I mean, I genuinely believe that as well. I also think that this agenda is one that hurts, people of color, because it's telling them what they are and who they are, and is telling them, that they are different somehow, and that they are to be defined and conscious of that difference. When how people relate to their ethnic background and race, that's personal.
Yeah.
Now, I get the fact that when you're Black, you have less choice, because when you pass, I can pass as white, but they can't. So yeah, people do look at you differently. I get that. But still, even in any of those contexts, ultimately, as an individual, you decide how you relate to these things. It's not this outside force telling you from, that this is your A, B, and C. And I also would wonder how these race programmers would react if we pointed out to them, for example, that in this last election, not to bring things back to politics, Donald Trump doubled the number of Black votes among Black men and women. He doubled his Hispanic vote, his Asian vote, even his Jewish vote. And, and that's not even talking about the improprieties. We're talking about what's known. I mean, I think if we remove the quote improprieties, he might have tripled that vote. I think he probably would have maybe even gotten a majority. So, when people think for themselves, they do what they do. And I think that I wonder what these left-wing, social activists would say about that. Do they think these people are stupid?
Well, they would think, they'd probably call them stupid, but they would be wrong. I think it is inherent in the fabric of our country. And really what they're doing is, you're right, they're trying to enslave the pot. They're trying to strip you of your individuality, all of us. We have to be in a group. This identity politics is you're not an individual. This intersectionality, you're oppressed because you're this, and this, not because you're an individual that can react to your situation either with dignity or without dignity. I mean, so the pressure's taken off of the individual in a certain sense, because we are in an identity crisis, obviously. And so they're trying to hand people identities that they can feel comfortable with. But the Smithsonian, I don't know if you saw this thing, they took this down, but they said hardworking, on time, blah, all these were characteristics.
Are racist.
Were racist white people. And I thought, how insulting to everybody else. So everybody else is a lazy, they don't like to work or make money or do any, everybody else is just horrible. I mean, and really it's racism, these social programming things. I don't know how I would feel if I was black, but if I was sitting in that room, I'd feel pretty weird, wouldn't you? Going, what is all this going on? Can't we just go to work?
No, it's actually the classic example of old-fashioned Rudyard Kipling white man's burden racism on the left. It's geneticism. In when you strip it down, it's supremacy, actually, that somehow black people don't want to achieve. That they say that when achievement in school is seen as racist. This is old-fashioned racism itself in the worst form. They actually do believe. I think that at the core, if you take a look at race studies, gender studies for that matter, ethnic studies in colleges, they actually believe that people are literally different based upon their race. They think black people are different than white people. They really do. They think it's like a different consciousness, even a different biological makeup. I think they do think that.
And they must think that because I'm thinking about the Catholic Church here because I'm Catholic, and that goes all over the place. You can't really say they don't really judge people.
No, I mean the Catholic Church is the most multicultural, diverse group in the world,
and it's based on a core tenet is respect for human dignity, not black dignity, white dignity, Native American dignity, human dignity. So it seems like it's a basic fix to me if we taught in our schools that you treat everybody as a human being, and you followed Martin Luther King Jr. and said you judge them on the content, on what they do, not what they look like, for God's sake. Judge them on what they do, not what they look like.
But yet they seem to want to keep this racist thing going. Certainly in the 1950s, yes, you had literal organized racism. And by the way, at that time, the black family was more intact. The black church was intact. Black entrepreneurialism was intact and advancing and doing so rapidly. But they, in the course of tearing down those barriers, which was good and which was, as I said, supported by, and for moral reasons, mainly as a Christian movement, they also set up these what have turned out to be de facto racist programs, anti-business, anti-family, things like massive national welfare programs as opposed to dealing with charity on a more local level where people could actually be helped. Attack on the black church, attack on black education with these rotten inner city schools where they have behaviorism and they oppose things like school vouchers so an achieving young black kid could get out of those schools and get into a charter school. They oppose entrepreneurialism because of their anti-capitalist attitudes. They have damaged the black community. They have hurt black people's growth. I think the black people have grown anyway, but they are responsible for many of the problems, social problems that black people now have, with their destructive programs, which in a de facto sense are racist, whether they want to think so or not. I'm not saying that they consciously think that, but after a while, when you see the failure of these programs and you see what they're doing, you can only conclude that they are racist.
Well, I think I've said this a couple times to people. If you want to make the charge that there's institutionalized racism and it's systemic racism, well, the left has been in charge of the education system for quite a while. I mean, so it's under their watch that it's become a systemic problem. Governments of some of these larger cities, Chicago, for example, they have big problems. So if there is systemic racism, they caused it. You're absolutely right.
Right.
And their obsession with it is, I really do think it's sort of a war against the individual. I don't want to believe, and nor do I think from experience, that people automatically judge you on what you look like. I think they judge you on your content of your character, which is probably the best way to do it. The solution to all of this, I don't know. I think we need to go back to in the article I wrote about, everybody's trying to control the narrative because there is no meta narrative. They're all fictive. Everything we do is basically fictive because it's relative. That can't hold. We have to have something to hold us together as a nation. And we can all agree on this. Our Constitution was written on the basis of a Judeo-Christian faith. It's also a separation. You're free to do whatever you want, but the foundation is here. And so we do believe in basic virtue, just basic virtues. I mean, we give people the benefit of the doubt, things like that. Be strong, courageous, try to do the right thing, to think about things before you do them. Instead of pitting each other, we just keep pitting one another against each other, especially with these programs we're talking about. That's not going to solve any problem at all whatsoever. But as long as we allow these to happen, so I was glad Trump booted him out of the federal government anyway, as far as he can. But that was an executive order, I believe, so it'll just get revoked if Biden gets in, which who knows, but
right. Let's not even think about that yet.
Let's not think about.
I'm not ready to go there. But I think also, just to wrap it up, I think that the fact that this program is being implemented is a reaction to the success of racial integration and the reduction of racism in this country to the point where they now have to invent it. I'll point to Charles Pierce. He's a in the 1980s, Harvard professor, I think he was of anthropology, who invented this whole concept of microaggressive theory.
Yeah.
And basically what it is that you take out a magnifying glass and you put someone under it and say, oh, you did something racist in 1956. You were seen in a hotel lobby with David Duke or something. They come up with something, and they only do it to people, of course, who are not on the left. I mean, they wouldn't do it to Joe Biden, who is, has had some terribly racist comments, even recently, talking about the country's doomed because we're not going to be a majority white country in 20 years. They'll only apply this standard to people who are not, genuflecting to the left, and they'll take out the microscope. And I think that the reason they're doing that is because you do no longer have, old-fashioned racism. You no longer, people don't do that anymore. We have changed. Even if some people still harbor racist views, they don't act on it. It's not a problem in the public sphere, in the same way that anti-Semitism isn't a problem in the public sphere. So they've invented it. They've had to keep it going. They've had and this is just a manifestation of that. So maybe it should be viewed in the context that it's good because it shows that we've advanced, that they have to invent it to such a degree that it's now become microscopic. It's like they're looking for a racist gene under a microscope.
I like that. I like ending on a positive note that maybe it is actually good because they're trying to create a reality that just doesn't correspond at all with reality.
Exactly.
And I trust that people instinctively know that too. I thought during the MTV generation, I thought racism was more or less a thing of the past with that up and coming group. There were intermingling. There was nothing. They weren't thinking about that kind of stuff at all. And then it got flared up again for political purposes. And so it's a vie for power. I don't think it'll stand, but I think we have to make a stand now. I think that for many years, people like you and me, I bet you, I don't mean to speak for you, but I just let it go because I thought this stuff's so crazy. It has to implode on its own because it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But now they don't have to make sense. They just an ad hominem attack. If you disagree with me, you're this and this. But
that's right. And they are using the last bastion of control, which is they're controlling the internet. I mean, I know that I got this show right now on YouTube, and I'm grateful for that. And just to be ensured, I should mention that the program is carried on about a dozen platforms in case YouTube takes it down. But nevertheless, they get to control the means of communication. They get to decide whose vote is counted, through electronic voting machines. They get to decide whose opinions are aired due to big tech. So, this is what they've resorted to. it is a complete top-down power grab. It is authoritarian because that's who they are. And that's what we're going to be looking at in these next years. And the focus of my work this next year, at least, whether or not President Trump is inaugurated, and I still think there's a chance he will be, but even if he isn't, or even if he is, the big fight is going to be against big tech censorship in the immediate manifestation, but also in the broad sense, a fight against what they're calling the Great Reset. I don't know if you're up on that, but you're a good writer, Jack. You should look into that and do a column, because this is going to be the big topic of next year. So, Jack, let my viewers. Go ahead.
One last thing. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was in one of his speeches said something like, all of this, the whole communist nightmare, was a manifest hatred of God. And at bottom, I think that's what this is too. I think you were right. The dark side of the Enlightenment, people thought reason made them God. So that's the dark side of it, and they're still running with it. So I guess we still have to fight them on it.
It's going to be with us in every generation. It's the sin of the Garden of Eden. Yep. That's why God exiled us and banished us from the garden, to find our way back. And it's, they defied God, they defied nature, and they were our parents. So anyway, Jack, where can people read your excellent columns and get information about you?
They could. I write quite a bit for the Catholic World Report because they're quick turnaround. But I write for the Imaginative Conservative and the New Oxford Review and various other places. I'm starting a new project, but I think I'm going to tweak it a little bit more before I advertise it at all. I'm going to try to go out on my own a little bit, because it's tough being in academia. I'm telling you, it's not, as a conservative.
Talk about banishment. Anyway, but Jack, listen, keep me posted on your project. Maybe we could do some work together on that. And
okay.
I appreciate you joining me today. Thanks a lot, Jack Gist.
Thank you for having me, and Happy New Year again.